All right, Johnny, fun conversation today. We're chatting with two of our colleagues from the Flow Research Collective, Dr. Carol Grojean and Dr. Brent Hogarth. So Carol is an organizational psychologist. She has 3 different master's degrees, but also a Ph.D. in organizational system psychology. She spent a lot of time at Microsoft. She spent the last couple of years working for Flow Research Collective, coaching people how to get into the flow state. And so we're going to talk to her and Brent about flow today. Tell us a little bit about Brent.
Right, so Brent's a sports and clinical psychologist from Vancouver, Canada. He's also a humanistic existential psychologist, and he's an expert in training flow state, as you said, with Flow Research Collective, but also mindfulness and self-control, particularly for sport and corporate athletes. And he's got a lot of training in kind of providing peak performance training to people for performance enhancement and also mental health counseling.
Right, yeah. So we start out, we'll get into both Carol and Brent's sort of definitions of flow, but also more importantly, how flow relates to, what we're focused on here, which is human flourishing, right? Chat a little bit about kind of integrating the self, the difference between doing versus being, integrating the me, integrating the we, kind of like how to do this, how to find more flow in your life.
Yeah. I love talking to Brent and Carol today about kind of how they define flourishing, how they define flow in relation to flourishing, how we can get more flow in our lives. And also I particularly liked talking to Brent about his work on the dark side of flow. He did his doctoral research on this, the kind of the possible negatives of flow. And I loved digging into that and what he had to say about that based on his research in that area.
Yeah, nice kind of wide-reaching, robust conversation. So we hope you enjoy. Here's our chat with Dr. Brent Hogarth and Dr. Carol Grojean.
Hello, friends.
Good to see you, John. Good to see you, folks.
Good morning.
Again, Brent, on the other side of the interview this time. It was great.
Yeah, it should be fun. Looking forward to it, man.
Lovely to meet you, Carol.
Thank you. Nice to meet you as well.
So we're going to start, I think, just a little bit more on the personal side. We'd love for our listeners to get to know you both a bit more. Carol, let's start with you. You both have such interesting backgrounds. I think you would define yourself, you please correct me if I'm wrong, as an organizational psychologist, right? You're an expert in leadership, among a variety of other things. Just share a little bit of your background and sort of how you arrived in sort of this peak performance world.
Oh, wow. I'm always a little hesitant on the word expert because, I think you said it best once on the FRC. The more I learn, the more I realize how little I know. It gets quite humbling at some point. How I got to where I am? Oh, gosh. Well, I think it started about maybe even 25 years ago. I was early in my career at Microsoft in their IT organization, and they were investigating how to build high-performing teams. And I drew the short straw, which is ironic because I was on maternity leave. So how do you draw the straw? But nonetheless, it's probably one of the best things that ever happened to me. I got partnered with a fellow from Carnegie Mellon and the Software Engineering Institute. He was the kind of the father of the capability maturity model, but hated how it reams of process, not about how we build high-performing teams and organizations one person at a time. So he inverted it and came up with a new process that I got to put at Microsoft, and that started me down the passion of really looking at individual and team performance and how do we build that and how do we create those capabilities for people bringing their full self to their work and bringing it to something larger. And I started off in the IT organization, but quickly after a couple of years, I got tapped by a couple of leaders and Bill to go. Microsoft was in the middle of its Vista issue and was brought in to do some performance studies, some time on task studies, run a couple of pilots with some of the engineering teams to figure out what's happening and how do we course correct. And then that just cascaded into a series of larger and greater opportunities to go in and do large organizational re-engineering efforts, whether it's our developer tooling. I went in and re-engineered and led the Windows 7 product release after Vista. I've done manufacturing supply chain, I've done cloud and quantum computing, but each one also had me meet with greater challenges as you try to change or align larger and larger human systems. So every time I would get I got brought into something, I simultaneously went back to school to try to learn more and understand it more, until I ultimately got to a point where I realized I can re-engineer teams, organizations, even get to the point of leaders. But at the end of the day, it's what's going on inside each and every person and how they bring their full self and how they choose to lead and participate with others. And there's a longer backstory there, but it basically also led to an existential quest of me really looking at myself. And in that's when I stepped away and traveled around the world and studied different cultures and became really fascinated with culture and human behavior. And in some ways, some of our indigenous cultures and how they live, relate to the larger world around them, or relational, non-linear, rather transactional and linear. And but it all became about me. It was my Ph.D. So it was that kind of that couple decade evolution of education and work and greater opportunities and introspection that got me to where I am now.
Yeah. Just real quick, did you casually name drop Bill just now? I think you mean Bill Gates.
Yeah.
Love it. Just wanted to point that out. So I love how you just subtly threw it in there. That was terrific. Yeah, so it's super interesting. It's part of why I was excited to talk to you both together, because you seem to, in some ways, I think have had some similar experiences, but almost sort of inverted. And so, Brent, I'd love to bounce over to you. I would think, you please correct me if I'm wrong, you sort of came to kind of peak performance after sort of maybe a spiritual journey, you might call it, right? And really trying to get to know yourself. Walk us through your background a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. And Carol, I just want to share, when you talked about the kind of relational aspect of your growth and recognition of the importance of that, I felt like as I looked at all four of our faces on the screen here, we're kind of like around a campfire, just like really feeling like connected to each other, and just I really value you highlighting that. And you've always brought that in every engagement I have with you. So so my story goes back, grew up in Vancouver, Canada. I was kind of a go start from a young age, a little bit of an out of control youth. I was a national gymnast, so athletics was a big part of my background. But I had two brothers, very violent kind of household. I was in and out of court as a kid, and I was also kind of a big graffiti artist. So I was out trying to get my name to be seen. I was breaking laws. I was getting into a lot of fights, and I'm quite poor in school and getting sent to a military school after a court kind of proceeding. And that was the first time in my life where I eliminated distractions, had structure to my life, and I excelled. I excelled with the opportunity to grow, to have responsibility, and to find focus and flow really in my academics for the first time. Interesting enough, right as soon as I left this military school, I recognized that all the external reinforcers I had to find flow and structure were no longer there. So I got into a lot of trouble again, no longer kind of having that external reinforcement. And so, as I know with a lot of us in life, pain is a great motivator. And after the end of a relationship in college, I always remember looking at myself in the mirror and just my life, and not really liking what I was seeing, not really kind of accepting myself at that point. And so I'd just go to random churches, pick up random books. I was never raised religious or spiritual, but I picked up one book. Actually, sorry, my mom gave it to me. It was a tiny little Wayne Dyer book. I think it was called The 7 Secrets to Happiness or something like this, full of roomy quotes and short tidbits. And that kind of lit the first fire of kind of inner awareness for me and some spiritual values. I ended up doing a Deepak Chopra retreat. And right after that, I went to India and 2-week stay in a Buddhist monastery and in McLeod-Ganj, where the Dalai Lama lives. And then I spent another 2 months there doing a yoga teacher training course and really getting introduced to Vedanta, Eastern philosophy. And it was that point in my life where the clarity in the Buddhist monastery that the nun would say that, she would define what the mind is, the causes of suffering, the causes of happiness, how we can really purify our negative karma. And she gave us a path. The teaching in Tibetan Buddhism is called the lam rim, the lamp on the path. It was the first time I had clarity to free myself from my internal suffering. And I would say at that point, I mentioned earlier, seeking self-acceptance. I learned that the part of me I was seeking to accept really didn't exist in the way I thought it did. That ego, that identity I thought I had to repair and change and fix up. I learned to kind of let go of that and create some space. And that gave me the flexibility to take my life in a lot of different paths, to have flexibility and adaptability. And so, and the one thing what led me into psychology is the Buddhist nun. She's a really badass nun named Robina Corton, amazing nun.
Badass nuns are the best nuns, I've heard.
Yes. She said, you are the boss. She said, this is what Buddha says. You are the boss. You are responsible for your karma, for your thoughts. He is just a cognitive behavioral therapist. And so she planted the seed for psychology for me. And so I found this great program, a master's in sports psych, doctor in clinical psychology down in San Francisco. Ended up living in this hippie burner man active in Haight-Ashbury. And that, introduced and kind of intersected my passions. And then, I can talk a little bit later on around my dissertation, but I picked up a book in the library around, it was called Transcendental Experiences in Sport, Exploring the Spiritual Underground, something along those lines. And it was all these quotes about athletes talking about being in the zone, essentially being in flow. And one of the things it pointed at is that these athletes didn't necessarily have a philosophy to understand what was going on in those peak moments. So they got into a lot of trouble outside of their life trying to recapture this sense of kind of transcendence. And it really helped me understand myself. And that's what I ended up doing my dissertation on. And here I am a few years later with the Flow Research Collective.
So we should mention, because you both brought it up, we the three of us got to know each other, and then eventually Brent, you interviewed John for the Flow Research Collective podcast, but we sort of all know each other through this concept of flow, right? And the flow state. And I think that's a pretty good segue into getting into some of the content. I'd love for both of you to maybe sort of, define or conceptualize what you think of as flow, because I think it varies a little bit from person to person, and we all kind of share an operational definition through our work, but my guess is you each might have some differing views. So Carol, let's start with you. How do you think of, the flow state and maybe also its importance in sort of overall life satisfaction and flourishing?
That's a great question. I've been thinking about that one. And I think for me, it's a felt sense that the what of what I'm doing and the who and the being, heart of my being, is aligned to my passions. And in that alignment, I'm grounded and I'm present. Ironically, in that presence, I have a greater sense of clarity and capacity for something new and unique to come out of me. So I think it's just that felt sense of that integration of being and doing, and bringing it fully to the work or to in the present moment, to whatever is in front of you in the moment. Because for me, prior to getting into this and really understanding it, I spent way too much time in my head and in the intellect and not fully in my heart. And for me, flow and flourishing is when the two are in balance in service to something greater that I'm really passionate about.
It's really interesting you bring that up. And Brent, I want to give you the space to respond as well. But we recently just had a conversation with Dr. Matt Lee and Dr. David Johnson about flourishing. And one of the things that came up is SBK, who you both know and I think really adore. And his book, Transcend, one of the things he sort of walks the reader through is that ultimately kind of these quote unquote peak experiences, and we often call flow a peak experience, really is characteristically a result of, or at least experiences less self-salience and more kind of interconnectedness, right? And this being and doing, but shutting things down and just sort of existing as one with your surroundings. And your response there, Carol, made me think of him. So
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Brent, how about you?
Yeah, so I often fall back on how Csikszentmihalyi initially defined flow. And for me, I love, he described it as order and consciousness. And so I think there's a number of ways we can tie this back to also what Carol said. I think when we're living in alignment with our values, when we're fully expressing ourselves, there's a sense of order and consciousness where there's no data coming in where we have to, that conflicts against who we are. There's no chaos that we're having to reorganize. There's a sense of order or harmony. And so that's the simplest definition I've found of flow. So I try to stick with that one, a sense of order or structure and consciousness, clarity of goals, engagement in that. And I'll also just add a little bit of nuance. I think it's important to, a lot of our clients, let's say with the Flow Research Collective, they recognize there's a flow state that we talk about, where there's this kind of accelerated productivity, creativity, learning, heightened performance in many regards. And it's these kind of distinct states. But a lot of clients, in our programs really come with also quite a rich spiritual practice. And they recognize that there's this kind of other sense of flow. There's this kind of deeper sense of a pervading openness to experience, pervading sense of maybe being embodied in the moment, as Carol was saying, that I think is a little bit distinct from this kind of hyper-focused productivity state. One way I often frame it up is, and I mentioned this in my dissertation, so I started my dissertation just about quickly with the quote that the first and greatest victory is to conquer oneself, by Plato. And so in a flow state, we conquer the self, I believe, by becoming so absorbed and engaged in the task that we lose a sense of who we are. So this is very functional and distinct context. But then in the more mindful or contemplative state, we find flow not by becoming so absorbed in the content of what we're doing, but by learning to let go of the sense of self. And by conquering the self in that way, we can be fully present to what's here now and find that deeper pervading sense of flow. So I think of flow a little bit on those two spectrums, but I usually come back to that initial flow, definition that it's order and consciousness. I said a lot there. I hope
they're both great answers. Yeah, I know John wants to jump in here and bridge some connections. Those are great.
Yeah, that was very clear, Brent. I mean, I also wanted to ask if maybe the way that Carol defines flow resonates with the way you've lived your life and the fascinating story you just gave us a moment ago about your upbringing and your education. Something that really struck me was when you talked about this fire being lit in your education, where you started walking around churches and reading books and read a book on happiness, and a fire was suddenly lit, and that's when things changed for you. That reminded me of a quote that's often attributed to William Butler Yeats: education is not the filling of a pail, but the lighting of a fire. Right. And it sounds that, a fire was lit for you and your life has really changed for the better since then. But I mean, the way I understand your kind of life story is that you've really focused on kind of both being and doing, in the sense that, you've got a lot of training in physical activities. You've worked, your undergrad degree was in kinesiology, the study of the movement of the mechanics of body movements, and you trained as a fitness trainer. You lived in India and you lived in a Buddhist monastery, trained as a yoga teacher there, and you're a humanistic existential psychologist. So it seems to me that your life, the way you live it, and your practice and your craft, to use a word that I know you like to use, brings together being and doing. So does Carol's definition of flow also connect with your definition from Csikszentmihalyi of this kind of merging together of the kind of the thoughts about life and the way we think about things and our actual activities that we engage in?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, to be succinct, I feel that the path of doing is incomplete without the path of being. And I've been privileged. My parents are both entrepreneurs, ended up doing fairly well later on in my life. And I've seen that, the privileges of material wealth doesn't bring happiness, and I'm my number one client, right? I've realized that I can achieve in sports, achieve in other areas of my life, and still really the sense of, we could say, languishing, this sense of just not feeling fully embodied and with let's just say, an open heart.
I also want to dig in on this a bit more, Carol, this integration that you said in terms of how you define flow on the being and doing. I mean, by that, do you mean the loss of yourself within your actions, such as you're so absorbed in what you're doing that this distinction between being and doing just becomes dissolved, such that you are one with the thing you're doing, as it were, they merge into the same thing? Is that what you mean because you said integration, is it that you integrate being and doing, they connect together, or is it effectively they merge together and they're just one thing? Yes,
absolutely. That was very well said. Right. It is the integration or the merging of them into that present moment that I define as flow, and I think an optimal state of being a human and flourishing.
Would you say that was much of your experience? I mentioned earlier that your and Brent's experiences seem sort of inverted and that they happened at different stages of your life. But have you sort of been on that journey since you sort of left Microsoft and you said started traveling the world and doing a lot of internal reflection? Has that been sort of your personal trajectory?
I mean, I would say that's just been my quest, right? I mean, a short backstory. John is in 2014, I was in the middle of that $7.5 billion merger. And, not to the degree Brent went, but I had been spending a couple of years yoga, meditation, reflecting on my life, studying Buddhism, contemplating how I was showing up until I just couldn't take it anymore. Because what happened is my external state of doing at work was pulling more and more in my ego and pulling more in me. But because of those contemplative practices I had started doing, and I had watched both my mom and dad die of fluke cancers, and now my husband was suffering through leukemia. And so my state of being inside of me started waking up and pulling, almost like that midlife crisis, pulling at you to there's got to be something more to life than just work and more and consume and right. And I was caught in the middle of this war, and I couldn't take it I couldn't take it anymore. I was overwhelmed. I was burnt out. I was stressed. So in the middle of that merger in Helsinki, I just quit. I up and quit. I might have said a few choice words, but I up and quit and walked out. And and the next week, I cut off all my hair and gave away all my things. And the following week, I found myself in the Serendanda region of Nepal. And I woke up one morning and I opened up my tent doors. And in front of me, because we had hiked there the night before in the dark, was the Himalayas. And I wept for hours because what had happened in that moment is the sacred and the profane in my life had flipped. The 20 years I had spent consuming and amassing and gaining and wanting more and building, acquiring more, all of a sudden that sacred of my life became so profane. And I realized I could have gone my whole life and never seen the beauty and the majesty of these beautiful beings in front of me, the Himalayas. And I wept for hours, not able to rectify, right, what was happening. And then I turned to the right of me and I see these kids on this dirt field with a partially deflated soccer ball. And I'm amongst their village, so I see how they live and all they need and could want for. But they're out there and they're playing. And between them and myself, I see my son home in a warm, big house, nothing he needs, nothing to want, on the ground, checked out of life on his Xbox. And I asked myself, what was it about my culture that led me to who I had become? And what would it take for me to transform my definition of myself as a means of changing the world around me? Because we don't see the world as it is, but as we are. And that doing, I was like, why does my culture value this and not value this majesty and this connection? And that's what I spent the years just trying to my Ph.D. became an excuse for me not to go back to work and to continue to unravel what was it about my culture, right? And what do I need to do? Or how can I become that more integrated, flourishing human in a human system? And I also just, as a parent, like I was like, oh my God, how can I do this to my children? I'm actually preventing them from fully living a life.
Yeah.
So I came home and destroyed the Xboxes, which not my son. My son wasn't so happy with. Like, thank God for YouTube, because we had to learn to build a fence. We learned how to can food. We learned how to drywall a garage. None of it looked really pretty, but it's like you have to get re-engaged with life and back into that being while you do.
I think you just gave us the episode title, The Key to Flourishing, Destroy Your Xbox.
How did you just destroy it? Did you like sledgehammer this thing, or just defenestrate it out a window? What'd you do? Okay,
Nice.
Listeners, Carol just gesticulated.
Not one, but two of them.
Wow, this must have been quite a lot of fun, actually. It must be quite, I take it, did the kids watch? That'd be quite traumatic.
No, they didn't watch.
They didn't know. Was there some catharsis in there with the sort of the subconscious connection of Microsoft? Yeah,
I may have gone through a bit of an anger phase, angry at my culture and like working through it all. Yeah, it was certainly a journey.
I have a question to try to tie what your question was, John, to what Carol said there, to what I think is, and maybe you guys can correct me if I'm wrong here. When I think of positive psychology and I'm reading through the research, a lot of this for me is certainly the systematic study of a lot of religious practices. And for instance, a lot of Buddhist practices in particular, because that's the kind of perspective I come from. And so you asked the question to Carol around self-transcendence, I believe, right? And when I think of, from a Buddhist perspective, Buddha mentioned that we suffer to the degree to which we are out of touch with reality, and we harm others to that same degree. And the root ignorance that they talk about in Buddhism, right, is this sense of grasping to an inherent sense of self, like this belief that there's this I, and putting it above others, praising it, protecting it, and how, to deroot that delusion and move towards a beingness, interconnectedness with others is really, to many regards, the path.
I want to just quickly comment, Brent, you made the comment about positive psychology specifically. It seems to you that it's kind of just, systematizing the study of religious practices. And I don't remember what year, probably 2016, 17, something like that. I was working at a school in Los Angeles, and was teaching positive psychology, was interested in sort of exploring positive education. And so I got in touch with the University of Pennsylvania. And you both know I'm sitting in Philadelphia right now, and got to know Dr. Karen Rivich, who's the director of resilience training at the UPenn PPC. And you mentioned badasses earlier. I always tell her she's a badass psychologist and researcher. And she's got a great book on cognitive behavioral techniques, among other things. But we were sitting having lunch one day on campus, and she told me that her feeling is that positive psychology is science that's catching up to grandma. And what she meant is it's really just science that seems to be confirming what most of us all knew all along, and that our grandmas always told us, right? Some simple ideas like just give it time, right? Hedonic adaptation, right? Oh, see the glass half full, cognitive framing, right? Some of these different things. So that's what popped into my head when you made that statement. But nice. I want to give space to Carol. I don't know if you wanted to respond to that at all. It seems like we're drawing more and more connections, which we've done in previous episodes as well, to sort of emphasizing a little bit more of the me and a little less of a little bit more of the we and a little less of the me.
Yeah, it's definitely, it's again, I guess it's the integration and the melding of it is that, I don't want to go into the whole we are one and different philosophies, but Brent's right. In some ways, it is that kind of more contemplative study, be it Buddhism or others. Like, I think he and I both read various parts of Upanishads and Ramayana. And there's so many great texts out there. But it is, and that's also when I think of the indigenous studies, it is that part of like, it's relational, and there's so much wisdom out there, so many grandmas and so much wisdom. Right. And how do we create the space to hear and integrate that wisdom? And it's hard in a day that is sucked up with these things and constant noise and distractions and others vying for our time and attention. A lot of this starts with, at least I'll speak for myself, but I'm sure perhaps Brent could speak to it as well. It's creating that space where you actually can drop in and listen to something greater and breathe.
Yeah.
Okay. And I think that's where your human flourishing journey begins.
Yeah. Gaining perspective on these things.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And as a quick note, sorry, John, Csikszentmihalyi, so the founder of flow theory, which is action oriented, he said that, he called it, two paths to reach enlightenment, or he said complexity of the self. One, he called it the vita activa, so the path of action, and then vita contemplative, so a more contemplative path. He actually over-indexed. He said there's greater benefits in over-indexing towards more of a contemplative path to find wholeness. And from a guy, from my understanding, quite an action-oriented philosophy of flow. I think there's something important to take from his insight on that too. Sorry, John, I cut you off there, sir.
No, it's fine. I mean, just to go back to your question as well, Brent, you asked about positive psychology and its research on religions. I mean, it's certainly the case that with Csikszentmihalyi, there was a lot of research on yogis in particular. He often talks about the practices of yogis as, really people who are heavily, educated in and engaged in the practice of doing yoga to an extremely high level, of them as being paradigm or exemplars of flow, getting into the flow state in an exemplary way within certain religious traditions. Draws upon other religious traditions too, and you find that as well in the work of Seligman. But there's also in the work of Seligman, positive psychology, Martin Seligman, there's a lot of studies on people in the military as well, emerging as kind of subject matter. And then in more recent times in positive psychology, there's of course now thousands of people have taken the questionnaires that the University of Pennsylvania have online. So it's broadened a lot, but yeah, you're right that religious communities and religious history and religious studies occupied a large part of the subject matter earlier. I want to now connect up. I want to go back to Carol's story about destroying the Xbox and connect that up with some of Brent's research as well. So you're both familiar with, and you both work on things like flow triggers, the activities in life that can trigger flow states and things that can really generate a high state of flow. And games are often things that can bring one to a state of flow, and video games are one of those, especially with children, they get immersed in these things. And if only we could harness that level of focus and a desire that people often have to play like a computer game and channel it into something more productive, like certain, like learning in schools, let's say, or certain work activities, you imagine the potential that could be achieved in those areas. Now, I know, Brent, that you've done some research on the dark side of flow, so bad consequences that can happen as a result of flow. And I remember you told me one of the areas you looked at was addiction to video games, I think. Yep. And that maybe connects with perhaps what Carol was worried about, that your children were maybe too much in the flow state, but in an area where you didn't want them to be in the flow state, namely just absorbed with their screens. And you want them to be more productive, fulfilling, intrinsically rewarding and important activities with their time. So Brent, can you tell us a bit about your research on the dark side of flow?
Yeah, and I think this will actually connect a lot of the things we've already spoken about. So we've mentioned how the benefits of transcending a sense of self, right? But now here's the dark side of it. We can transcend and lose our sense of self in the activity that's not going to allow us to live in alignment with our values, to not make a benefit to society. And so flow, as we know, it's a neutral state. I think, forget the exact quote I was going to mention there from Csikszentmihalyi. He correlated to nuclear fission, right? And so there's good that can be done with it or negative. And so when I think about the dark side of flow, simply I understand it as how flow can lead to a loss of self-control. So we get so absorbed and engaged in a task that we no longer think about the long-term consequences of it, right? It's an intrinsically rewarding activity. We want to do it, we want to keep engaging with it, and we've lost a sense of self of who we are. And so therefore we're not conscious of those consequences. And so, some of the research, video games is a great one. There's even research in There's exercise addiction. There's research in essentially because there's a loss of sense of self, we no longer interpret the risks of things appropriately. So again, example, like action adventure athletes, they're no longer interpreting the risk they can do to themselves, obviously of fatalities, which is quite often in action adventure sports. And when I think of self-control failure, sadly, that's probably the greatest self-control failure is accidental death. And so we see that often and often. And so what I'm pointing at here is that, yes, it's a state where we get so absorbed, we get addicted to it, and it can lead to negative consequences. That's one angle of it. The other angle, and it's going to tie again to this concept we were talking about a little bit earlier about self-grasping, is this down the backside of a flow state, where no longer are we feeling all the euphoria and joy of being in flow. And now we feel this, maybe it's boredom, maybe there's some depression, some anxiety, and this come down. Right. And we, because we've been so focused in our culture and society to, especially within, let's just say, action adventure sports, to get that high, that this state can feel so unmanageable. And that's where I think more of having a contemplative practice to be able to accept, to be present, to come into that being, as Carol has mentioned earlier, is so important on this high performance path to both have the tool of flow to get engaged, to get absorbed, but also to have mindfulness to be present on the come down, and also to really appropriately choose when do we want to transcend the self and get absorbed in the task we're having, right? That's a big piece that I think we all need to be mindful of as coaches and as people listening. We find flow in contexts that have great structure, and we want to be mindful of that structure, and then know it's safe, jump in, lose ourselves in it. And then when we get out of that structure, reset and say, okay, I'm no longer on the football field. What are the rules of how do I stay self-control now, going home and being with my partner, whatever it may be. So that's a little bit of the research on the dark side of flow. And I'm happy to answer any questions. It's very fascinating. Again, as from my life story, I grew up fighting over and over again, street fights, going to court. And those are the peak moments of my life as a teenager. And graffiti, jumping on trains, billboards, and those are the moments that created my sense of identity. And I got such a joy and rush out of them that I had to, I'm still my number one client, trying to manage finding flow in presence and deep connection and moving in other areas. So it's kind of my whole life story and wrapped in my dissertation there.
Brent, have you read Dopamine Nation yet?
I haven't, no.
So it just kept popping into my head as you were talking here. I know, I think all of us are fans of another very popular podcast, Huberman Lab, and he's had Dr. Anna Lemke on to talk about this. She was also, I just heard her on the Next Big Idea Club's podcast. That was wonderful as well. But she's an addiction specialist, an MD at Stanford. She was really one of the primary, I think, advisors for The Social Dilemma on Netflix, right? And part of what she argues in this book, I want to make sure I kind of summarize it accurately here, and then I'd love to get your thoughts and responses, is essentially what she calls a pleasure-pain balance, and that we are actually sort of evolved, whatever terminology you want to use, to sort of teeter and totter back and forth, right? And that what we're seeing more and more is a society and a lot of people who aren't willing to sort of, whether it's teetering or tottering, back to that come down, right? That unpleasant state. And what we often do is we just keep filling it, right? And chasing more dopamine. And then paradoxically, and this could be through video games, social media, food, whatever it might be, what we paradoxically end up doing is we raise our dopamine set point, right? And in doing so, we require more and more and more of these things, even just to feel normal. And subsequently, we actually always feel miserable. And this is basically kind of the entry point to addiction. I think I summarized that more or less. I see you shaking your head here. So that must resonate, huh?
Yeah, absolutely. Carol, I'd love to hear your perspective on this. I have lots to say too.
Yeah. I mean, I think, I don't think you have to add the word normal. It's just that to feel anything, right? I think they lost, when I think of the dark side of flow, I think of people who have lost touch with reality. and they're ungrounded. So when I think, or when I at least look through the lens of my children and gaming addiction or phone or other, I think they lack purpose and meaning and belonging and community. And the more they do it, the more they lack those, and the more they lose touch with reality, and more begets more. So that's why what you said, Nick, resonated with me, because when more begets more and we lose those things, we will do anything to feel anything. A little bit like the Stanford prison experiment, right? Right? We will take negative attention over no attention, over being ignored. So I think that, I don't know if that's necessarily the dark side of flow, but the dark side of flow is a sense of untethering and becoming ungrounded. Like we see a lot of people who go have an experience, a transcendental experience, and actually don't come back from it. They lose touch with reality and almost flip, right? And go all in on that other world or that other sense. Or, in a lot of indigenous realms, it's somehow also called the wall of grief, when you reach a point where you realize your behavior on the impact of the larger world. And the majority of the people do, particularly when we don't have elders in the community to help facilitate the wall of grief. And an elder is not an older, they're not the same. People turn back in to project that feeling, that ungrounded back in on their society and some fundamentalist belief, not that they have to be extreme fundamentalists, or they ride along the wall of grief and keep wounding themselves, project instead of project. So I love that. I think earlier somebody talked about the concept of elders and community and people who can guide it, especially at times like this. But yeah, that's for me the dark side of flow, is that continually untethering and losing a sense of self, of being in a world and connection with other, and then we'll do anything to feel.
I love that, Carol. And the one thing, to try to answer that question that you also pointed to, Nick, and I think this ties back to what you're saying, Carol, is I'm a big fan of reading some history of Gandhi and his path to Satyagraha. I'm not sure if you gentlemen have heard that term before. I'll describe it quickly here for the listeners too. But he talked about what he called the law of suffering. And he talked about how through suffering we gain moral, we can purify our soul, or we can learn moral truths. We grow through our suffering. And you're kind of pointing to, Nick, how this culture, our culture, myself included, we're constantly seeking joy, and then we lose out in learning these deeper truths or wisdoms about life. It's very interesting. We talk in Flow Research Collective about this flow cycle. And we talk about flow as in this kind of on and off switch, but it actually starts off with a stage of suffering, a stage of struggling. And I know some callers are a big fan of Nietzsche, and how Nietzsche kind of really celebrated people's suffering, kind of acknowledge, this terrible thing happened to you, this terrible thing happened to you, like what a life you've lived, And I think that's a perspective that we could all, appreciate more and more in this culture that kind of has forgotten those lessons. And it's a hard thing to say out loud, because then when bad things happen, you have to take it on the chin. But I think it's something I'm definitely learning moment to moment as well. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, some of my hardest experiences have been my largest growth, right?
Sure.
So completely agree.
Yeah. Well, this is great. This is fascinating. Thank you for sharing these perspectives on flow. And let's try and now connect this up with human flourishing. So, we all obviously agree that flow is something intrinsically good, something that we want in life, and something that, and the research suggests it can significantly enhance well-being and performance, fulfillment of potential, and fulfillment in the sense of life satisfaction. It has many wonderful things about it, but there's a dark side of flow, as Brent's pointed out, and connects perhaps with the reasons Carol destroyed those Xboxes. But so, I mentioned flow triggers earlier, things, activities in life that can bring about a flow state. Is there perhaps, I'm trying to figure out what we might learn from this about where the warnings lie with flow, where we should stop or take a moment, because it could, rather than promote human flourishing, actually hinder human flourishing and be depleting of well-being if it has this, given that flow has this dark side. So, starting with you, Brent, because you focused on your research in this area of the dark side of flow. What are, if you like, the flow warnings, things that we should watch out for with flow, so it's actually something that brings us to optimal human performance and experience rather than depleting human performance and experience?
Yeah, great question, John. Thanks for bringing us back here. So so just very briefly for the listeners, when we talk about a flow trigger, what we're mentioning is things in your context or internal ways where you can drive your attention to be in the present moment, and you can reduce the amount of thinking you're doing so that you can shift into being in that fully embodied, fully present state and kind of get out of your own way, as we mentioned here a bunch of times, transcend the self. And so when I think about, the obstacle or the challenge to overcome the dark side of flow is oftentimes learning how to regulate one's emotion effectively. Okay, we're very driven by our emotions. So ensuring that the actions that we're taking are in line with moving towards our values despite the emotional state we're in. So if I'm feeling angry, I'm not engaging in activities simply to release or to change or control my emotional state of anger. I'm moving towards this activity because it's in line with my values. That's my compass. So when I mentioned earlier, video games, internet addiction, porn addiction, gambling, all these things are the dark side of flow. If people perhaps had more of the capacity to be present with what's the emotional state they might be feeling, maybe there's a sense of loss or a sense of boredom, as opposed to trying to shift that emotion simply by engaging in a high flow activity. If they're able to be present with that and refocus on what's a value that they can find deeper meaning in, I feel that will bring more human flourishing and avoid some of these dark side elements. And so I'm going to quickly, and we can build on this all together here. As a therapist, I work from a framework called acceptance commitment therapy. And the focus of acceptance commitment therapy is to help overcome this concept of experiential avoidance, this tendency, again, of wanting to avoid or change our emotional state. And so in ACT, we learn how to get out of that game altogether and refocus on our goals. So my answer, very simply, John, would be development of mindfulness, which underneath that is emotion regulation, because we know with more of an emotional balance or equanimity, it improves perception and goal engagement. And I feel that will lead to greater self-control, greater flourishing, and living with alignment with the values. So that's my simple answer. I'm curious how you guys might be able to build off that or challenge it.
I want to let Carol respond, but I'll just quickly say, Brent, it's interesting you bring up experiential avoidance. Next week, we're chatting with Dr. Todd Kashdan. I don't know if you know Todd's work at all, but he's big on research around experiential avoidance. He's got a wonderful, wonderful book, I think cleverly titled The Upside of Our Dark Side. And it's really about sort of the advantages of unpleasantness more generally. And so one of the things he really rails against is exactly that, experiential avoidance. So we've got a series of questions for him about that exact topic. But Carol, how about you?
I mean, for me, it's simply when somebody starts to define themselves by the state or the activity, as opposed to that's something I am doing or creating, but that's not who I am. And I think once people start to blur the lines and define themselves by those things, then they start entering the dark side, because then they want more of it because that's how they define themselves. We're seeing it in youth as well, when they start showing up and lose sense of themselves versus being defined by the avatar they create and who they are online. And then we're back to being more ungrounded and losing a sense of reality. So my biggest warning sign is just when somebody starts to define themselves by the activity or what they're doing. Or I see it in corporations too. They define themselves by their title and their role. Mm-hmm. And not that those are positions I occupy, but those are not who I am.
Right. So flow is defined as a state in which one loses one's sense of self. But if, it can have a dark side where that becomes definitive of who you are as a person, such that you can't regain your sense of self out of it. You just go in and you can't get out again. And that might be a way of visualizing the dark side of flow.
Perfect. Okay. Yeah. You don't come out of it. We're back to that integration of being and doing. You lose that integration.
Yeah. Okay. Nick, do you want to on this?
Yeah, I'd like to take us in a slightly different direction here because this is a wonderful conversation. It also strikes me as, in a way, I think we all enjoy somewhat academic, maybe even slightly abstract or esoteric. And I think, Carol, you're doing really interesting work right now around, I think, what you sort of titled Flow for Everyone. And it's got me thinking about just how do you bring some of these concepts that might feel a bit abstract, right? I think people can understand what the flow state is on a somewhat tangible level, but when we try to teach people sort of, well, how to do it, and then say, well, to Brent's point earlier, you do it by not doing it. In some cases, it's hard to wrap your head around, right? So will you just tell us a little bit more about some of the current work you're doing around kind of flow for everyone, and how you're sort of translating some of these ideas for populations that don't necessarily come in with these sorts of language or academic training?
Sure. Yeah. Two endeavors. One is in Cameroon with a group of people that I spent some time with a couple of years ago. The other one that we're kicking off that's going to be more structured around some of the work we do at Flow Research Collective with a group of Arapaho Nation and some other marginalized communities in Wyoming. And so the question is really how can we bring the awareness of some of these practices to people who may not have the conditions or have the experience or have the education. And more importantly, actually, it's not about education, it's about the awareness of some of the habits and practices of our daily lives may work against, and often do work against, us trying to accomplish something greater for our lives and for our communities. And so how can we raise that level of awareness and work with them and coach with them to understand how to build greater habits and practices, how to find their passions, right? Too often right now, particularly in youth around this world, they struggle between the desires and the passions of their heart and the shoulds of their culture, and they get lost. And that loss can manifest in many different ways, depending upon how the culture supports them and the communities that they're in. And some of our marginalized communities are just really struggling. And so how can we help the youth kind of rise through some of this awareness and these practices and what Flow for Everyone can offer? And help them create a community amongst themselves to support each other as they move through the next couple of years, in this case, particularly in a community college, because many of them are the first generation to actually even have the opportunity to go to college. And they come from different backgrounds. And so really, how do we take this knowledge in a meaningful way that can help them kind of recognize those passions of their heart and what they really want to do and be in this world, and then build the habits and practices in their daily life. Positive psychology basics, the things even simple as the importance of sleep, nutrition, hydration, and exercise towards our performance, interruptions and distractions, and actually a greater awareness for how this is taking us away from some of the things we're really passionate about. And a lot of times it's just awareness and conversation.
So, you might have just referenced there, we're kind of talking about some of the fundamentals of just good physiology, right? But I'm curious, where do you start with some of these groups? So, you're working with this group in Cameroon, you're trying to help them kind of increase awareness, get more access to sort of understanding and sort of cultivating these states. What are some of the starting points? Because this will actually bleed into some of our other questions for the audience, which is sort of like, okay, how do I do this, right? What's my starting point? Like some tangible, some tips and strategies and things of that nature.
Oh man, Brent, I look forward to helping me with this one. For me, it always starts with slowing down to hear their story and meeting them where they're at. I think some of the most I've ever been in my life is the time I spent in Southwest Cameroon, which is the oppressed region in the middle of a civil war. And these people who have so little would give everything to me, would protect me, have so many passions. It humbled me in so many ways. So it's a matter of actually stopping and hearing them and meeting them where they're at. And then where do they what do they have the capacity? Because in some cases, there's some of the practices we may bring to them, which don't even make sense in their world. So you have to start where they're at, not what you know.
Yeah.
And then you try to bridge the gap between where are they at and where do they want to go to? And what do they have the capacity, either in their beingness, right, or in the conditions of the environment they're in? And how do we help them get to that next step? I mean, that's not necessarily tangible, so I might need some help. And
no,
I can give a whole bunch of advice.
We can come back to sort of more general, tangible steps a little later. But I mean, you hit the nail on the head there, and I think
I would say the tangible is where they're at and what's their passion and how do they want to show up and where do they really want to move their life towards, right? And begin there.
I think it's always helpful. Csikszentmihalyi described how each culture develops flow activities as defense mechanisms against the chaos of society, of life. So each culture already has their well-ingrained flow practices, right? So whether it's dance, certain rituals, say yoga, meditation, whatever it may be. So as when working, with, a unique demographic or culture, I'd always be really curious to kind of go into the culture like an ethnographer, right? To really try to understand, learn from them, what are the practices they've already well established. And then I always try to like a bait and hook when I work with demographics. So I get them really excited, learn all I can about, their flow practices, and then say, all right, this is something you've developed very well in this context. What's the experience like? And they'll say, well, let's just say the concepts or the principles of flow. I'm very present. I'm engaged. There's a sense of joy. And then we can start to do how, let's say, a practice such as, let's just say, mindfulness or meditation can train up these similar qualities so that they can take it into a new context. And so that's how I would often kind of explore it, like show how they're already finding flow, where they already find it. Maybe for our listeners, it's gardening, maybe it's driving, maybe it's working on their car, maybe it's sports or deep conversation. So show how they already get it, understand the qualities of what's showing up there. And then we understand now with positive psychology that we can train all of these up. And then how do we kind of bring that back into a new context? And the big thing for me with flow training is recognizing that flow happens in high flow activities. It happens in contexts where there's clear boundaries, there's clear rules to be followed or something to be learned. You don't walk around life just serendipitously falling into flow. You might do that traveling or whatnot, but typically it's when you're really engaged in a specific focus. And that's why military school was very helpful for me. That's why sports has been helpful for me. Business for Carol, studying, all these different things, coaching sessions. So when we're trying to find flow is, understand where they find it, show that can be trainable, and then create context with clear rules and boundaries so they know what the aim is. And I believe that's like a kind of a little bit of a path that we can go on. Yeah.
Great. Thank you both.
Yeah.
Thank you. This is a fascinating direction this conversation is taking, and it connects very well with something else that we'd like to ask you. So you've both clearly got a strong interest in exploring optimal functioning and flourishing outside of what we might call the traditional channels, that is to say, areas such, Western, intellectual history and Western culture, and areas such as positive psychology, and the most common ways in which these are studied. So, for example, Brent, you've mentioned your various experiences ongoing within certain, practices that are often characterized as being Eastern practices such as meditation, mindfulness, yoga, and so on, and other sort of spiritual practices. And Carol, we mentioned your work worldwide in various cultures, learning, applying your craft, if you liked, there, and then developing it in certain other contexts. So we're particularly interested to ask, what are the most valuable lessons that you've each learned from these various institutes in which you're involved that speak to human experience and human flourishing that you could share with listeners? Carol, let's start with you on this one.
One of my favorite quotes comes from Mary Catherine Bateson, and she says, "I'm not what I know, but what I'm willing to learn." So honestly, when I go into many of these cultures, particularly in the past several years, I'm actually not going in there as a teacher. I'm going in there as the learner. So whether I'm trance dancing with the Bushmen or in Cameroon with some beautiful people learning how to recycle and clean villages in an oppressed part of the world, or a vision quest or sweat, or even we'll just call it plant medicine, right? I go in with the beginner's mind to see what can I learn from them. And that broadens my horizons and broadens like just my experience of life in beautiful ways. And then when it comes to my practice, it's then how can I actually return that gift to the person that I'm working with?
It's you can talk about the plant medicine. I think we should anyway, because Brent serves also an advisory role around, I think, some of these things as well, and has an interest. So let's go down that path.
Rabbit hole. Okay. Well, say more. For me, a journey, whether it's an ayahuasca or psilocybin or some of those other plant medicines, what they offer me is the experience of something greater than the tangible scientific world that I live in. I don't necessarily do it often, and I don't go there to escape this world. I actually go there for a different type of experience. In some cases, a greater wholeness. I feel like I'm unraveling a rabbit's hole or a rat's nest right now, but my greatest teachings has come when I come up against adversity or a fixed belief that I didn't even know I held on to, and am shown or given the opportunity to experience something greater than myself, for which then I have I come back from that with a greater gratitude for life and living, and a greater awareness of that there's so much more than we see and experience on a day-to-day basis. I think, as Stephen writes about and other research written about, there's 11 million bits of information available to us in any given second, and we only consciously process 150 to 200, which is 0.002%. So it's just any of those ways where I'm sitting with other cultures in a contemplative position, or maybe taking something that expands my consciousness, do I learn to expand and grow? And in that, I have less and less fixed beliefs. I once wrote an epistemology paper for my graduate program, which asked the question, what do you truly believe? And I literally said, I don't know if I actually believe anything anymore. Like, I started writing the question because my mom had just passed away. And I thought, okay, I believe my mom is dead. Or what do you truly know? Epistemology. What truly know and believe? And I was like, I know my mom is dead. But then I actually had to start unraveling the whole question. Well, what does it mean to be dead? If I still have a memory of her, is she truly dead? What is life and what is death? And that just unraveled me. So I'll pause there and let Brent respond.
I'll quickly jump in, Brent, just because the names come up twice, but you've both mentioned Stephen. Let me just clarify. Stephen Kotler, Executive Director of the Flow Research Collective, and journalist and best-selling author, and I think I know you didn't love the word, Carol, but I think we can call him a flow expert in many ways as well. So
it's all good. Yeah. He's good with that one. Thank you. Yeah, Stephen Kotler.
Yeah, John, to your question, so I would say, exploring different cultures, different lived experiences, you just get to get a wider perspective of what our human potential is. And I think, for instance, I've obviously gravitated towards some spiritual practices, spiritual communities, religious, a little bit in the Buddhist realm, at least, because their capacity for kindness, for joy, for laughter, for peace amongst, the chaos of life is something that I wasn't really exposed to when I was younger. And that, that transformed what I thought was capable for me. And so I think that's the great joy for me, is like exploring to see the potential, and what you learn from, these great teachers, that this is something that's tangible that anyone can achieve. And that was really enlightening for me. And so to kind of connect that back to psychedelics, I read a lot of research by Robin Carhart Harris, kind of one of the leaders in this field. And he's got a couple theories that kind of describe generally what occurs in a psychedelic state, which I think are helpful to just share. So he talks about what he calls the entropic brain and rebus model. So I'll start with the rebus model. So the rebus stands for relaxed beliefs under psychedelics. So when we're in this psychedelic state, these heavily weighted beliefs are kind of veils of perception become lightened. These, like, if you imagine them like weights, they become lightened. And we can go into the neuroscience. He suggests this is somewhat of a downregulation of the default mode network, this sense of self, how we typically interpret reality so that all chaos in the world can be structured. But in this psychedelic state, it loosens, the veils open up. And in this state, our openness to experience can really drastically be shifted. And we know openness to experience is correlated to mental health. We've mentioned experiential avoidance earlier. It's kind of a transdiagnostic feature of mental suffering when we can't be present with what shows up. Openness to experience is kind of the inverse to that. It's related to absorption, so strongly correlated to flow. Openness to experience is correlated to kind of an appreciation for art, for music, for just the richness of life, for sexuality. So it really helps us have a richer experience in life. And so the rebus model is a nice one to think about. And the last one I'll just share is he's got a recent article talking about how in a psychedelic state, it's a pivotal mental state. It's one where there's increased neuroplasticity and neurogenesis. So there's an opportunity in that psychedelic experience to really integrate, as Carol's mentioned a number of times, the insights that one has experienced into an enduring way of perceiving oneself, others, and reality that we can achieve without psychedelics, certainly. But for many people, it can really shatter some of those heavily weighted beliefs and perceive the world anew. And so I'll leave it at there, and happy to jump on any other questions on the field there.
Well, this is great. We can tie together, it seems, your two points quite nicely. Carol's was openness to learn, about what one can learn from some experience, and yours, Brent, was kind of openness to various channels of possible ways that one could learn or transform oneself and not be dismissive of certain things because they don't fit one's worldview or experiences so far. So they're kind of approach from the subject towards an openness to learning in the broadest sense, it seems, is the kind of one of the most valuable lessons that you've both taken from your various pursuits in various cultures. And that connects very directly with a question that we like to ask all of our guests, which we call the flourishing question, which is in the case of this interview, what's the one lesson on flow and flourishing you want our listeners to walk away with, and what might be a practical step for putting that lesson into action? So, Carol, to you first, the flourishing question. What do you think?
I think a human flourishing is a human who's following their passions despite the shoulds of the culture around them, that they're remaining true to their heart. And that's my greatest hope for my children. And then it comes back, as Brent said, it's that openness to learning and to being present to life. Like, it's the gift of life is to experience it in its fullness.
So authenticity and presence, if you like, is a way of capturing that, being true to self and being present in the thing that you're doing.
Perfect. Yes.
Okay. And Brent.
I want a quick comment. It also strikes me because we've talking a lot about openness. I think a lot of times, because you mentioned passion, Carol, a lot of times passion gets confused as something that is quote unquote discovered. And, we hear these great stories. Brent, you just mentioned you got a poster on your wall of Kobe Bryant, Michael Jordan, the first time I picked up a basketball, I just knew. And those are beautiful stories, but those are the outliers, right? I think passion tends to be developed over the course of time and remaining open to experiences and interests and pursuing curiosities and sort of pulling on the thread, as it were.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. The more experience, the more you pull, right? And the more you pull, the more you experience. And it just becomes almost a self-referential flourishing, right? And sometimes you pull and it doesn't feel great, but you still learn. And sometimes you pull and it opens you up to something beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. I think, what is it Joseph Campbell said? The privilege of a lifetime is being who you are. And so I think a human flourishing is a human who is being who they are.
Love it. Brent, the flourishing question.
Yeah. It's a great, tough question. Sitting back here, hoping Carol keeps going so I can have.
I know. Why me first every time?
We're hard hitting over here at Flourish FM. We ask the tough questions.
I think for me, and I kind of mentioned this earlier, is to know that in any area of your life, we can continue to grow and expand and reach new heights, and being present and achievement and meaningful relationships, of increasing positive emotions, of finding flow and engagement, just knowing that we have this great human potential, and it's our birthright to fulfill it. And in that process, in that journey, to recognize that the challenges that show up, internal or external, do not need to be obstacles to that fulfillment of one's human potential. Whether it's emotions, recognizing that they're transitory, whether it's life situations, recognizing we have the resources within us to overcome them, and to not limit ourselves would be the biggest thing that I hope that I can share with my clients, is just the continued belief in our unlimited human potential, and to not get caught up in our head and out of our life by trying to manage our internal world, but allowing, kind of giving up that game, turning off that struggle switch with our internal world, and just more and more returning to here and now, and our connection with others around us.
I think that's beautiful, Brent. One of the things, I don't remember the quote exactly, but it's so spot on. Every client, I'm sure I speak for you guys as well, every client I coach and every person we talk to, like, their greatest fear is to be on their deathbed and not have live their life fullest, right? And so that's really flourishing, is just whatever it takes, whatever I learn, wherever I go in life, it is the fact that I am on that path of learning and growing and achieving this. I think somebody once said, find what you're willing to die for and be willing to live for it.
That's such a perfect thing to sort of start to wrap up with, Carol, because you're absolutely right. For context, like, we always see sort of these surveys with some information before we meet a client. It's almost to the point where you don't even need to read that question, because it's almost across the board. Dying without impact, dying feeling unfulfilled, dying without, reaching my potential, making a contribution. It's really, really interesting. I'm glad you brought up that point.
Yeah. And I mean, it connects quite nicely with your practical bit of advice you gave, Carol. Part of it was it seemed to be captured as authenticity and presence, or at least that's how I understood it. Being true to yourself, what you're doing, present in the things you do. And you mentioned that about not, wanting to regret things on your deathbed. Interestingly, Bonnie Ware in her book, The Top 5 Regrets of the Dying, a great book, where she met many people who were at the end of their life and asked them what their biggest regrets of their life were. The first of those 5 that she writes about is effectively one that's captured by the notion of authenticity. I wish I'd had the courage to live a life true to myself, not the life others expected of me. And then she also says, another main regret people have is, I wish I hadn't worked so hard, that people had focused on things other than work, which connects with, some of the main things you've focused on throughout this.
Yeah, beautiful. Hopefully our children are listening.
Hopefully your kids are listening.
Present or future.
Yeah, love it. Yeah. When we throw out the episode, you just have to shove it in their face, say, listen to this, family. Absolutely. Listen, we want to be respectful of your time. No, you got to bounce. This was really a wonderful conversation. We really appreciate you both for showing up and bringing your expertise and knowledge and really incredible lived experience as well. Not only the scientific expertise. I've learned a lot, and it's been a lot of fun. And I think our listeners will take a lot from this as well.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Carol. It was a lot of fun sitting around this campfire together here. So I
was just going to say thank you, Brent, for bringing that up in the beginning, because it very much felt like we were storytelling and sharing around a fire. And I appreciate that. Yeah. Good. All of you.
All right, guys. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Huge thanks to all of you for listening to today's show.
If you like what you heard, please share it with friends, family, colleagues, and be sure to leave us a 5-star review. You can also find us on all social media platforms. We've got our own YouTube channel, and you can check out our website at flourishfmpodcast.com.
We'd also love to hear from you. There's a survey in the show notes you can complete where you can complete any suggestions on guests you'd like to hear us interview or particular topics or themes you'd like to hear us talk about. We'd love to hear your feedback on that. So your feedback would be greatly appreciated if you could fill out that form. Until next time, thank you very much for joining us today.
And keep putting in the work.